The November wind was already sharp enough to draw blood when the sheriff handed Helen the eviction notice. Her fiancé hadn't just broken her heart, he had legally banished her to a rotting shed on the property's edge. Winter was coming, and she was supposed to freeze. She didn't. The frost had already begun to claim the rugged landscape of Blackwood, Maine, when Helen Bingham's life was dismantled with the stroke of a pen. For 3 years, Helen had poured every ounce of her savings, her sweat, and her soul into the grand cedar log cabin sitting atop the ridge. She and David Carmichael had built it together, or so she thought. She had been the one swinging the hammer, sourcing the reclaimed timber, and writing the checks from her dwindling inheritance. David, a charismatic local contractor with a silver tongue and a hidden mountain of debt, had handled the bureaucracy. He had assured her that putting the deed solely in his name would save them thousands in property taxes due to a local agricultural loophole. Trusting him completely, Helen hadn't thought twice. That trust evaporated on a blistering Tuesday in late October. Helen had returned early from a supply run to find a sleek, silver SUV parked in the gravel driveway. Inside the cabin, surrounded by the warmth of the stone hearth Helen had built by hand, sat David and a woman named Sylvia. Sylvia wasn't just a brief indiscretion. She was the daughter of a prominent real estate developer from Portland. When Helen demanded answers, David didn't apologize. Instead, his demeanor turned cold, his eyes devoid of the warmth that had lured her in 3 years prior. He calmly walked to his mahogany desk, pulled out a manila folder, and laid it on the kitchen island. "You need to leave, Helen," David said, his voice flat. "Sylvia is moving in. We're getting married in the spring." The shock hit Helen like a physical blow. "This is my house," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I paid for the foundation. I paid for the roof." "You paid for gifts to my estate," David countered smoothly, tapping the deed. "Legally you are a tenant, and your tenancy is terminated. I've already spoken to Sheriff Boyd." Sheriff Thomas Boyd, a man who had eaten Helen's apple pie at the town bake sale just a month prior, arrived 20 minutes later. He looked deeply uncomfortable, refusing to meet Helen's eyes as he stood on the porch, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "I'm sorry, Helen," the sheriff muttered, adjusting his utility belt. "He's got the paperwork. It's ironclad. You have until sundown to vacate the main premises." Helen was utterly trapped. Her bank accounts were severely depleted, drained by the joint investments David had convinced her to make. She had no family left to call, and the nearest town with affordable lodging was 40 miles away. But David, in a final act of cruel, calculated magnanimity to keep the sheriff placated, offered a concession. "I'm not heartless," David said, standing on the porch with his arms crossed. "A year ago, I transferred the title of the Lower Acre to you. Happy early birthday. You can stay there." The Lower Acre was a local joke. It was a miserable, marshy strip of land sitting at the bottom of the ridge, bordering the fast-flowing Miller's Creek. It was virtually useless for building, prone to dampness, and hidden beneath a dense canopy of ancient, sun-blocking pines. Its only structure was a collapsed, 19th-century trapping shed that hadn't seen a coat of paint or a human occupant since the Hoover administration. With nowhere else to go, and a stubborn, burning refusal to be chased out of the county like a stray dog. Helen packed her meager belongings into her battered pickup truck. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in bruised hues of purple and black, she drove down the muddy, rutted logging road to the Lower Acre. The reality of her situation set in as she pushed open the door of the shed. It hung by a single, rusted hinge, screaming in protest. The interior smelled of wet decay and animal droppings. The floor was packed dirt, uneven and freezing. Gaps in the rotting wallboards let the biting wind whistle through unchecked. That first night, the temperature plummeted to 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Helen sat huddled in the corner on a camping cot, buried beneath every blanket she owned, wearing 3 pairs of socks and her heavy winter coat. She could see her breath in the dark. Above her, through the trees, she could see the golden, warm light spilling from the windows of her cabin on the ridge. She imagined David and Sylvia sitting by the fire she had built. The cold seeped into her bones, a deep, agonizing ache that threatened to break her spirit entirely. The Farmer's Almanac had predicted one of the most brutal winters in a decade for New England. In a few weeks, the nighttime temperatures would drop well below zero. Helen realized with a stark, terrifying clarity. If she stayed in this shed, she wasn't just going to be miserable. She was going to freeze to death. The first week of November brought a thin, dusty layer of snow that refused to melt. Helen spent her daylight hours patching the gaping holes in the shed with mud, pine needles, and scavenged pieces of corrugated tin she hauled from a nearby illegal dumping ground. She managed to install a small, rusted wood-burning stove she found half buried in the brush, routing the stovepipe through a hole in the tin roof. It provided a meager radius of heat, but the fatal flaw of the shed remained: the ground. The dirt floor of the shed was essentially a block of ice. No matter how hot the small stove got, the freezing earth sucked the warmth right out of the air. If she dropped a cup of water on the floor at night, it was a solid sheet of ice by morning. One bitterly cold afternoon, Helen stood by Miller's Creek, washing a tin plate. Her hands were raw, cracked, and bleeding from the constant exposure. She stared blankly at the water rushing past the ice-encrusted banks. The creek was wide and aggressive, fed by deep underground springs. Suddenly, a memory flickered in her mind. A documentary she had watched years ago with her late father about Roman engineering and ancient survival tactics. She looked at the ice on the edges of the creek, then at the center. The center was flowing fast, dark and clear. Because of the constant, rapid movement and the deep subterranean source, the core of Miller's Creek rarely froze solid, even in the dead of winter. The moving water hovered constantly around 35 to 38 degrees Fahrenheit. To a human body, 38 degrees is freezing. But to the frozen main Earth, which would soon plummet to 10 below zero, 38 degrees was practically a thermal blanket. An audacious, desperate plan began to form. If she could channel the constant flow of the creek directly under the dirt floor of her shed, the continuous circulation of the 38-degree water would prevent the ground from ever dropping below freezing. It wouldn't make the floor warm to the touch, but it would raise the ambient baseline temperature of the Earth by over 40 degrees during a blizzard. It would trap the heat from her small stove inside, rather than letting the frozen ground devour it. Helen wasted no time. She hiked up to the town's recycling center and salvage yard, trading her last silver necklace to the yard manager for a tangled mess of thick, heavy-duty black polyethylene agricultural piping and a pickaxe. The distance from the creek to her shed was about 60 feet, on a slight upward incline. She needed to dig a trench deep enough to bypass the surface frost line, lay the pipe in a serpentine pattern beneath her shed's floor, and create a siphon effect to pull the water from a higher point upstream, letting gravity do the work of a pump. She began to dig. The earth fought her every inch of the way. It was choked with thick, stubborn pine roots and heavy river stones. Helen swung the pickaxe until her shoulders screamed and her palms tore open, staining the wooden handle dark red. She worked from dawn until dusk, fueled by nothing but canned beans, instant coffee, and a localized white-hot hatred for the man sitting in the warm cabin on the hill. On the fourth day of digging, The first major twist of fate occurred. David Carmichael strolled down the logging road, wearing a brand-new expensive shearling coat. He stood at the edge of her trench, a smug smile playing on his lips as he watched Helen, caked in freezing mud, wrestling with a massive boulder in the ditch. "Digging your own grave, Helen," he mocked, taking a sip from a thermal coffee mug. "Sylvia says it's an eyesore. I could call the county on you for unpermitted excavation." Helen didn't stop digging. She didn't even look up. "This is my land, David. The deed says so. Leave." David chuckled, a sound that made Helen's stomach turn. "Just checking on my neighbor. When the real freeze hits next week, you'll be begging to sleep in my barn. I might let you, if you ask nicely." He turned and walked away, his laughter echoing through the pines. The rage gave Helen a surge of adrenaline, but the environment was unforgiving. That night, an early cold snap hit. The temperature plummeted to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. When Helen woke up, her muscles locked in agony, she found that the exposed earth of her trench had frozen solid. Her pickaxe bounced off the dirt as if striking concrete. Panic seized her throat. If she couldn't finish the trench, the pipe couldn't be laid. The project was dead, and quite possibly, so was she. Desperate, she began to build small, controlled fires inside the trench line, using precious firewood to thaw the ground, just enough to dig a few inches at a time. It was agonizingly slow work, but on the second day of the freeze, as she brought the pickaxe down hard into the thawed mud, she heard a hollow clang. She dropped to her knees, scraping away the dirt with her bleeding, gloved hands. Beneath the soil, she uncovered a large, flat slab of slate. She pried it up with her iron digging bar. Beneath it lay a perfectly preserved, dry stone culvert, an underground tunnel lined with river rocks. Helen sat back on her heels, staring in disbelief. She realized what it was, a remnant of an 1800s logging flume built by the original settlers to bypass the swampy ground. It ran directly from the high bank of the creek, passing straight under her shed and draining out farther down the valley. It was a pre-dug, frost-proof trench waiting to be used. Tears of relief cut tracks through the grime on her face. She spent the next 48 hours in a manic blur. She fed the heavy black piping through the ancient stone culvert. Inside the shed, she dug up the top layer of dirt, coiled the piping tightly across the entire floor space like a massive snake, and packed the earth tightly back over it. On the evening of November 14th, the sky turned a bruised, ominous grey. The local radio warned of a massive, early-season blizzard. Winds were expected to reach 40 miles per hour, bringing temperatures down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit. With the first snowflakes beginning to fall, stinging her face like glass, Helen waded into the freezing creek. She submerged the intake valve of her pipe, securing it under a heavy rock at a high-pressure point in the water flow. She ran back to the shed and opened the release valve at the back wall. For a terrifying minute, nothing happened, just the sound of the wind howling through the trees. Then, a low gurgle echoed from the ground beneath her feet. The pipe sputtered, spat a mouthful of dirty air, and then a steady, heavy stream of creek water blasted out the back pipe, draining away into the woods. The siphon had caught. The water was flowing. That night, the blizzard slammed into Blackwood. Outside, the world turned into a howling, deadly vortex of white. Trees snapped under the weight of the ice. Inside the shed, Helen sat on her cot. She had stuffed every crack with rags and stoked the tiny wood stove until its metal belly glowed dull red. She waited for the inevitable, creeping death of the cold to rise from the floor. It never came. She took off her glove and placed her bare hand flat against the dirt floor. It wasn't warm, but it wasn't freezing. It felt like the earth on a crisp autumn morning. The continuously flowing 38-degree water beneath her was creating a thermal barrier. The heat from her tiny stove, no longer fighting a losing battle against a frozen floor, began to fill the small space. By midnight, it was -15 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Inside her shed, Helen unzipped her heavy coat. The ambient temperature in the room had stabilized at a miraculous 55 degrees Fahrenheit. She had survived the first strike of winter. But as she listened to the storm rage outside, she knew this was only the beginning. The real battle with David, and the land itself, was yet to come. December descended upon Blackwood, Maine, with a ruthless, biting ferocity. The initial blizzard was merely a prelude to a season of record-breaking snowfall. Yet, a thin, persistent ribbon of grey smoke continued to rise from the chimney of the rotting shed on the lower acre. Helen Bingham had transformed the impossible into a sanctuary. Her life became a rhythm of survival. She spent her days chopping firewood from fallen timber, reinforcing the shed's walls with stacked cordwood to add insulation, and carefully managing her meager food supplies. The ambient temperature inside her makeshift home consistently hovered in the upper 50s. The earth beneath her feet, warmed by the tireless, rushing waters of Miller's Creek, siphoned through her heavy polyethylene piping, acted as a massive thermal battery. When the wood stove roared, the small space even bordered on cozy. Up on the ridge, however, the golden lights of the cedar log cabin were masking a growing bitterness. David Carmichael stood by his floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows, holding a glass of expensive bourbon. He glared down at the valley. The sight of Helen's smoke rising through the pines was a daily insult to his ego. He had orchestrated her ruin flawlessly, or so he thought. He had expected her to crawl to him, begging for a bus ticket out of the county, or at the very least, to abandon the shed to the elements. Her quiet, stubborn survival was making him look foolish, especially in front of Sylvia, who was already growing fiercely bored of the isolated rural winter. "Why is she still there?" Sylvia complained one evening, wrapping a cashmere shawl tightly around her shoulders. "You said she'd be gone by Thanksgiving. It's creepy, David. Knowing she's just down there in the dirt, watching us." "She won't last," David snapped, his charming facade cracking. "We're due for a polar vortex next week. The temperatures are going to drop to 30 below zero. A shed can't withstand that, no matter how many blankets she hoards." But David's arrogance was gnawing at him. He couldn't fathom how she hadn't frozen to death during the November blizzard. Driven by a toxic mix of curiosity and spite, David waited until a moonless Tuesday night to investigate. Dressed in a heavy snowmobile suit, David trekked down the steep, icy embankment toward the lower acre. The wind howled through the barren branches, covering the sound of his heavy boots crunching on the frozen crust. As he neared the shed, he expected to find a frozen tomb. Instead, he felt a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the air. He pressed his gloved hand against the shed's exterior wall. It wasn't radiating heat, but it wasn't radiating the deadly, biting cold of the surrounding forest either. He crept around the back, toward the creek. There, illuminated by the beam of his tactical flashlight, he saw it. The thick black pipe emerging from the creek bed, disappearing into the old stone flume beneath the shed, and the return line pouring water back into the current downstream. David was no engineer, but the contractor in him immediately understood the genius of the geothermal loop. Helen was using the kinetic energy and the subterranean warmth of the creek to insulate the ground. A dark, destructive fury washed over him. She was outsmarting him on his own property. Without a second thought, David waded into the icy shallows of the creek, raising his heavy steel flashlight like a club. He intended to smash the intake valve, choke the pipe with rocks, and let the lethal cold reclaim the dirt floor. He swung hard, but the creek rocks were coated in a treacherous, invisible layer of black ice. As his weight shifted forward, his heavy boots slipped. With a panicked shout swallowed by the wind, David went down hard. He crashed backward into the rushing 38-degree water. The shock of the cold was instantaneous and paralyzing. It punched the breath from his lungs. Water flooded down the collar of his expensive suit, instantly soaking him to the bone. Gasping and thrashing, David scrambled up the slippery bank, his flashlight lost to the current. He was shivering violently, his teeth clicking together like castanets. The mile-long hike back up the steep, snow-covered ridge was agonizing. By the time he reached the back porch of the main cabin, his clothes were frozen stiff, his skin a dangerous, mottled blue. He had intended to freeze Helen out. Instead, he had nearly given himself lethal hypothermia. He spent the next 3 days bedridden with a severe fever, while the thin grey smoke from the lower acre continued to mock him from afar. By the second week of January, the dreaded polar vortex finally arrived. The National Weather Service issued emergency warnings across the state. Blackwood recorded a staggering, bone-shattering temperature of -32 degrees Fahrenheit, accompanied by wind chills that stripped the heat from a human body in minutes. Inside her shed, Helen faced her ultimate test. She fed the wood stove continuously, sleeping in 2-hour shifts. The walls creaked and groaned under the assault of the wind, but the floor held its ground. The creek water, protected deep beneath the ice layer, continued to flow relentlessly through the pipes under her feet. Her sanctuary held fast at a livable 48 degrees. Up on the ridge, the grand cedar log cabin was facing a crisis its owner had never prepared for. When David had taken over the paperwork and finances for the cabin's construction, he had systematically cut corners to siphon money into his own failing contracting business. While Helen had obsessively researched the foundation and framing, David had hired unlicensed, cut-rate subcontractors for the plumbing and heating systems. He had instructed them to bury the main water lines barely a foot underground, well above the deep main frost line, to save on excavation costs. He had also opted for a cheaper, undersized propane furnace, assuming the massive stone fireplace would compensate. At 32 degrees below zero, the bill for his deceit came due. At 2 a.m. on a Wednesday, the main water line leading from the well to the cabin froze solid and shattered beneath the frozen lawn. An hour later, the pressure build-up caused the pipes inside the poorly insulated crawl space to rupture. David and Sylvia were jolted awake by a horrific snapping sound, followed by the hiss of rushing water. Ice-cold water sprayed wildly beneath the floorboards, quickly seeping upward and soaking the expensive hardwood floors. "David, do something!" Sylvia shrieked, wrapping herself in a duvet as the temperature in the bedroom began to freefall. David rushed to the utility closet, but the cheap, undersized furnace was already flashing a fatal error code. The frozen water had compromised the electrical panel. The heavy log walls, without the constant output of the furnace, began to rapidly absorb the freezing outdoor temperatures. By sunrise, the grand cabin was a disaster zone. The water on the floors had frozen into treacherous ice slicks. The indoor temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees. Sylvia, weeping hysterically, packed 2 suitcases, called an emergency private transport service from Portland, and demanded they brave the dangerous roads to rescue her. She didn't offer David a seat in the SUV. "You're a fraud, David," Sylvia spat, her breath pluming in the frozen living room. "This house is a death trap. Don't ever call me again." As the taillights of Sylvia's rescue vehicle faded into the whiteout, David was left entirely alone in a dark, freezing, shattered mansion. His cell phone was dead, and the power grid for the entire county had just failed. The cold began to physically hurt. By late afternoon, the indoor temperature was 0. He tried to light a fire in the hearth, but the wood was damp, and his trembling hands could barely strike a match. Panic, absolute and primal, finally set in. He was going to die in the very house he had stolen. There was only one place within walking distance that had heat. The trek down the ridge was a nightmare. David stumbled through thigh-deep snow, his face wrapped in a scarf, his extremities going numb. He fell twice, barely finding the strength to stand back up. When he finally reached the lower acre, he collapsed against the heavy wooden door of Helen's shed and began to hammer on it with his frozen fists. Helen, who was sitting by her stove reading a weathered paperback, stood up slowly. She unbolted the door and pulled it open. A wave of glorious, earthy warmth washed over David. He fell to his knees in the doorway, a pathetic, shivering mass of snow and ruin. He looked up at Helen, his face pale and tear-stained. "Helen, please," David gasped, his voice barely a whisper. "The pipes broke. The power is out. I'm freezing to death. Please let me in." Helen looked down at the man who had stolen her money, stolen her home, and legally banished her to the dirt in the hopes that she would perish. She looked at his blue lips and his violently shaking hands. She didn't feel triumph. She didn't feel hatred anymore. She just felt a cold, hard clarity. "You can sit by the stove," Helen said evenly, stepping aside. David scrambled inside, crawling toward the radiant heat of the small iron stove. He huddled there for 2 hours, weeping quietly, as feeling painfully returned to his fingers and toes. Helen didn't offer him a blanket. She didn't offer him a cup of the hot chicory coffee she was drinking. She simply sat on her cot, watching him. When the worst of the shivering subsided, Helen spoke. Her voice was as unyielding as the frozen ground outside. "You have until the storm breaks tomorrow morning," Helen told him. "Then you are walking into town. You will go to Sheriff Boyd, and you will sign the deed to the ridge cabin back over to me. You will legally surrender the entire property." David looked up, his eyes wide. "Helen, I can't do that. I'm financially ruined. The repairs, the loans." "I don't care about your loans," Helen interrupted, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "You built a house of cards, David, and the winter blew it down. You can sign the deed over, or I will let you walk back out that door right now and take your chances on the ridge." David looked at the thin wooden door, listening to the deadly howl of the -30 degrees Fahrenheit wind outside. He looked at the warm, stable earth beneath him. The earth Helen had engineered to save her own life. He had completely underestimated her, and it had cost him everything. Slowly, utterly defeated, David nodded. "Okay, I'll sign it." The next morning, the winds died down, leaving a pristine, brutal, and silent white world. Helen marched David the 3 miles into the town of Blackwood. They walked into the sheriff's station, where Arthur Pendleton, the hardware store owner, and Sheriff Boyd were huddled around a space heater. Both men stared in shock as Helen, looking healthy and resolute, pushed a frostbitten, broken David Carmichael toward the front desk. The town had assumed Helen had either fled or perished. Instead, she had emerged as the undisputed master of her own fate. The winter that was meant to break Helen Bingham became her forge. By spring, David Carmichael's shortcuts bankrupted him, leaving the ridge cabin foreclosed. Helen didn't just survive the freezing abyss of Blackwood, she conquered it. Standing beside the rushing waters of Miller's Creek, she looked at the land that was finally, undisputedly hers, ready to build a new foundation upon the unyielding earth she had brilliantly tamed.